Okay, so as I was saying, I mean, in 22, a couple of years ago, I say that we're still very far from this type of technology being available to users. And I'm going to show in this presentation that I was so wrong. Okay, so what I'm going to be doing here is some kind of reverse engineer so that we can then end this presentation by showing you something that reminds us of this kind of type of interaction that we just saw between Samantha I forget the name of the guy and sorry. Theodore and Samantha. So we're going to get back to it later. Okay, so before I proceed, I would like you to imagine, okay, so now we're going to reverse engineer this, what we just talked about. So I'd like you to imagine a classroom, a typical language classroom, right? And you know that in this class, time is usually a constraint. There is simply not enough time to do all the things we want to do. For example, there is very little time for listening, for speaking and writing, for interaction. So there are limitations in the classroom, right? And we know that in order for second language learning to take place, people need access to input. They also need opportunities for output, that is, for producing language, either speaking or writing, and they're also required to interact, right? Interaction is important because this is when they negotiate meaning. This is how they test their hypotheses to share, to make sure, I mean, to see, to verify whether their hypotheses are correct or incorrect, for example. So we know that this is very important. By the way, before I forget, the presentation is all color-coded. So green refers to the input, red refers to the output, and orangey refers to interaction. So if you get lost, you don't know where you are, you'll be able to recognize by this color scheme. Okay, so just to summarize some of the limitations, we note that the second language classroom, because of time constraints, is limited in terms of input, right? The quality, quantity of this input is not ideal for learning. This opportunities for practice as well is very limited. And finally, we also have limited opportunities for interaction, which is also important because this is the environment in which learning is likely to be perfected. And this is where learners are more likely to develop fluency. Okay. Okay. So now go back to that scenario that I mentioned earlier. Imagine a classroom in which technology can facilitate those types of issues that we described. For example, the technology can listen, the technology can speak and or write, and the technology can also interact with learners, right? In this presentation, we're going to talk about three types of speech technologies. We're going to talk about text-to-speech synthesis for I would say for giving learners access to the input to the language. Then we're going to switch to speech recognition, which is really a tool that can be used for speaking practice and also for writing, as we're going to discuss later. And finally, we're going to talk about these types of interactive technologies, such as translation tools and IPAs, right? Okay, so let's start with text-to-speech synthesis. For those who are not familiar, it converts text into speech. So I'm going to give you some example. This is a typical one, free, online, and these are some of the things that it does. You can change the gender, you can change the age of the speaker that you want to listen to. You can also control the pitch, whether high or low. You can also decide whether it's going to be sad, happy, and so forth. You can change the voice speed as well, right? The words that are being read are highlighted. You can also listen. More importantly, you can listen to these speech samples. So I selected three different types of voices just to give you an idea. One is a North American male, the other one is British female, and the other one is a child, just to give you an idea. So I have three samples for you to have an idea about the quality of these voices.
A pilot and four passengers were flying in an airplane.
The passengers were the Prime Minister of Canada, a university professor, a schoolboy, and a nun.
All of a sudden, the plane started to shake.
So you can have an idea about the quality and how that could be a very interesting tool for teaching and learning. There have been some studies that have looked at the quality of this type of input for learning. So for example, you see here two studies that were done in the second and in the foreign language
Last
context.
Christmas, Jimmy received the best present. It was a parrot. After a few days, the parrot started to speak.
So
Last
this,
Christmas, Jimmy received the best present. It was a parrot. After a few days, the parrot started to speak.
so we can see that the first one is very likely to be the synthesized voice, right? Although the quality is much better now, what in play now are exactly the files that we use in this study from 2015 that was replicated later and published in 2020. This is just to give an idea of the kinds of voices that we had at the time, right? That I can say that these voices are much better nowadays. So we looked at, we evaluated from the context of second language learning 7 different aspects. We're going to talk about some of these measures in a few minutes, but the takeaway message is that in all of these measures we looked, they were similar. Learners were not really, I mean, in terms of intelligibility, they were able to understand, they were able to transcribe what they heard, they found them intelligible. The only item in which they differ was in naturalness. The voice still sounded robotic. And that, interestingly, only in stories. Stories, I mean longer passages, not in words or sentences. In words and sentences, there was no difference. So only really in larger prosodic units. Research has been usually very positive about the use of this technology for learning. We have seen, for example, for pronunciation, for vocabulary, and willingness to communicate. So that is, the use of TTS has a positive effect on the learning of these features. What teachers can do in this context? Teachers can develop activities in which learners can be involved in the process of discovering things. For example, discovering patterns in pronunciation, learning how to, for example, if you're learning French, right, to learn the differences in pronunciation for the suffix ent. Sometimes it is pronounced, sometimes it is not. So instead of giving your students the rules, ask them to be involved in the process of discovering that what the pattern is in the language. You can also create more targeted listening materials. For example, your students are learning this difference that I just told you about. You can create activities that play with these different words. For example, il parle, they speak, or lentement, in which the nt is pronounced like an an. So this is the difference that I was referring to earlier. Okay, if you're interested in this kind of research, I'm going to talk about some ideas that can be implemented. This one here is a relatively new idea of using high variability phonetic training. What is interesting about this is that, it reflects that what I call limited exposure oral comprehension syndrome, which is that, scenario or that situation in which a student can understand everything that happens in the classroom, can understand their peers, the teacher, but when they go outside, they cannot. They have a very hard time understanding others, right? So it's very similar to this image that I have on the screen, right? So this is the French that I learn at school, and this is the French that I learn when I'm in a French-speaking country, like France or Quebec, right? So this is the idea behind it. So the idea is that in order to improve the representation of new sounds, of new forms in the grammar of these learners, we have to make it variable. So we have to increase variability. And TTS is an amazing tool because the teacher obviously only has one voice, right? One accent. So ideally, you could complement that with different voices, with different accents. Not only different varieties of the language, but also different pitches, different ages, and so forth. So I think that could be a very interesting venue for research. You can also explore other features of pronunciation and go also beyond pronunciation, examine listening. For some reason, there is very little listening, studies on listening using TTS as a platform, as a system. Anyway, you have some other ideas here, but one that I'm very, very, very interested in is the last one, the electrocephalography that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes if we have the time. So if you're interested in doing this kind of research, right? For example, you want to replicate some of the stuff that I've just showed you. So what would you do? I mean, you to investigate, to analyze naturalness and comprehensibility, we use these scales that you can see on the screen. So for example, learners would be asked to rate what they heard in terms of naturalness using scales similar to the one you see on the screen. The same thing for comprehensibility, which is one's ability to understand, right? We're not really sure whether the person understands, but it's your perception of how much you understood. So you can ask also learners to say, how much do you think you understood? But you can also ask questions that are more specific, like comprehensibility in terms of comprehension, right? You can ask the students specific questions about what they heard listening to TTS to see whether they're able to answer the questions correctly. You can even create different groups, one in which the voice is synthesized and the other voice is human. And then you compare the two to see if they, if there is any correlation or if the two differ. So to continue with this, you can also use tests of intelligibility. Intelligibility in pronunciation research is merely you listen to it and you transcribe, and then you compute the number of errors, the total number by the number of errors, right? So, and this will determine how intelligible the speech was, right? So these are the kinds of things you can also do. You can compare, for example, transcription by TTS voices and a transcription made by human-generated voices, and then you can see whether they differ. Research shows that there is no difference between the two as of our days, I mean, based on the status of synthesized voices now. You can also, this is something that has not been looked at, but I would be very interested to find out, like studies that use more say cognitively heavy tasks such as shadowing. So you would listen to TTS and then you would repeat as fast as you can and as accurately as you can. So by doing this, you can measure, the accuracy of the repetition, but also the latency, how long it takes. And then you can compare a group that is using TTS only and the other group that is using human, and then see whether one would take longer than the other. The one that takes longer is probably more cognitively heavier than the other. Same thing for fatigue, right? We can also look at fatigue as one of these measures of cognitive load, whether one has more than the other. What is very important about this kind of research, if you're interested in conducting them, is that you have to make sure that you have different types of target items, such as words, sentences, and larger utterances. We found, for example, that TTS up to the late 2000, up to around 2019, for example, it had a hard time with longer passages. It was okay for words and sentences, but when it came to longer passages, it had a harder time in terms of intonation and prosody. So if you interested in learning with these types of technologies, you could, with this type of technology, you could, there are two ways of investigating pronunciation. You can use it, either use a discrete approach in which you have one focus and then you investigate it with a pre and post-test design, or you can also look at pronunciation from a more holistic perspective, in which you really look at those measures that we talked about earlier: naturalness, intelligibility, and so on. So you could, for example, have a group using text-to-speech and the other group not using text-to-speech, and then come up with a set of activities in which your participants would be engaged in. And then at the end, you would verify which group did better. Okay, it is possible, and in my research, in fact, it's very possible that there will not be a difference, which is good, right? Which is good. I mean, this is a very interesting, this is in fact what we found in our research, that there was not much of a difference. But the beauty of doing this is then you can, teachers can maximize their resources and use the resources they have for other things. So for example, instead of practicing those types of activities in the classroom, they could be using class time in a more effective, in a more efficient way, right? For other things, for example, for providing feedback. Technology is not that great at providing quality feedback. So this could be maybe an opportunity in which teachers could relocate their resources to focus on things that technologies cannot provide, right? There is also the issue of high variability phonetic training. You could have, for example, this is very similar to what one of my PhD students is doing now. So what she's doing is one group is learning English with one voice only one TTS voice, while the other is using 5 different voices. Okay, and the results have been very interesting so far. The group that has been exposed to more voices is doing better, particularly in more holistic measures of pronunciation, such as intelligibility, comprehensibility, and accentedness. So we're now switching to automatic speech recognition, which is the red that you can see, as you can see on the screen. So now we're switching gears and going to speaking, right, and recognizing. So for those who are not familiar with the technology, I'm going a little bit faster because I don't want to be too behind schedule. So I hope you're following me. If I'm going too fast, raise your hand. I can read people's faces, but sometimes I'm not as good at it. So don't hesitate to say, can you say that again? Okay, so ASR is a technology that does the reverse. You speak and it transcribes, right? And the kind of feedback that we can have in this type of interaction is very interesting because it's not the type of feedback that we usually have in the classroom, right? It's personalized, but it requires some training. For example, I'm learning in English the distinction between E and E, the 2 vowels, like as in heat and hit, right? Those two vowels. So I think I learned, right? I at least in my mind, in terms of processing, in terms of I'm okay with it. But then when I try to produce, if I mean to say hit, but I see it written as heat, so I know that this is not the correct form, right? So I'm going to practice a little harder to try to get to the right words. There are many technologies that do this. You probably have seen some of those technologies. You probably have used them, but you probably use them on your regular, especially Smart TV or Microsoft Dictate and so forth. So the research has been very positive about the use of ASR for learning. So this research has shown, for example, that when learners are engaged in this type of interaction, they are more likely to learn certain forms. But regarding the quality of ASR, we have found that it's not quite there yet. Humans still do better at transcribing, at evaluating, right? But we're getting much, much better. For example, this study from the last one, I have the McCaughey and colleague, they found only a gap of between 3 to 5% between the two, which is very optimistic if you compare, for example, with texts that were made with a similar study that was conducted in the early 20s, in which they claimed that we have to be very careful with this type of technology because it is not able to understand approximately 20% of what second language learners use. Right. So the idea was that it was not good at that time, but now we can ascertain that the technology is pretty good and very ready to be used. Again, the research has been very positive for pronunciation. There have been very interesting results for pronunciation, for spoken grammar, and users usually see this technology positively.
All right, me lo passò.
Sorry. Okay, so if you're interested in using this kind of technology in your classes, one way you can do is for self-practice. For example, students could dictate a passage that is written and then analyze the errors, right? So this could be one way of doing it. Another way could be practicing minimal pairs. So for example, you're learning the difference between heat and hit, so you practice those minimal pairs. The same thing for the Francophone, for the French ENT suffixes. For example, you could provide your students, or they could find those words, from a list, from a reader. You could ask your students, select other words in ENT in French.
That's a good one.
And then play. And then you will listen to it and then try to categorize and then try to pronounce it and see what the outcome is. So you receive the feedback and then decide whether it's appropriate or not, right? You can also use it for fluency practice. You can get a text and read it out loud and then speed it up now by making it faster and faster. This is important for the for the development of fluency, of oral fluency. And what is interesting about this is that what you really checking, verifying is intelligibility, whether the system is able to transcribe the words that you are saying. And obviously, you can also use it for writing purposes. Again, if you want to do this kind of research, it's very simple. Usually, you compare ASR to either other ASR systems or ASR, or automatic speech recognition, to human voices. And basically, we calculate the word error rate. It's very simple. You just look for the errors. So what errors are there in the transcription? And you compare to the original source. And then you can make those correlations. The one, obviously, that has more errors are the ones that is not as good as those that have fewer errors. So it's very straightforward. And there are many ways in which you can do this. There's a whole literature on analyzing and evaluating this kind of technology. If you want to use this for learning, you can, again, do the same thing, focus on a particular aspect of pronunciation. You can even focus on vocabulary, right? Using that discrete versus holistic approach. And then you engage your students in some kinds of activities. Using a post-test design, you can see how much learning took place over the treatment period. If you want to do research in this area, there are lots of different opportunities, avenues for you to explore. We can look at other skills. We can also look at biases. Biases is I would say it's the new thing nowadays. People are talking about biases in these systems. For example, they're trained usually with young male. Male used to be in the past. Now I think in terms of gender, it's more equal. But in terms of age, it's still an issue. For example, we're finding that it has a harder time understanding older people after the age of 50, for example. This is what the study found. I'm over 50, so way over 50. So anyway, but these are very cool avenues for research. You have it on the slide. But one that I'm very interested in, that I'm going to talk to you a little bit more, is using ASR as a writing tool. So using it as a writing tool, which I refer to as the voice revolution. So this is just an overview of the history of writing, or the major breakthroughs, right, in the history of writing. So we started with the Sumerian tablets, the printing press, ballpoint pens, the more recently thumb typing because of the rise of cell phones. And now there is what I call, voice typing, or the voice revolution, which is the use of your voice. And what is interesting about this is it feels like, it's coming to the beginning where the spoken word prevail. So you're using a tool that is natural for many people who are able to speak, right? So you're giving those people a tool for them to write and potentially participate more actively in the types of conversations that we're having in our days. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this project, and I'll find it. So in this project here that is still ongoing, we're looking at acceptance, like how are learners ready to accept this tool? Second, we want to look at their behaviors while they're using. And it's interesting because, there was not a lot of research about this kind of, about the topic of what happens, what correlations are there with certain behaviors and outcomes. We want to be able to establish, if you do A, you're gonna get X. If you do B, you're gonna get Y. So those are the types of things that we're aiming when we're looking at behaviors. And finally, we want to look at the quality of the text produced, particularly when compared with keyboarding, people using the traditional way of inputting text. So I'm going to be talking about how to do the research and the methodology at the same time. So for the first stage, which is the acceptance, we're asking, are learners willing to accept technology for their learning. This is very, very important in early stages of learning because if learners are reluctant to use a new technology, there is no point in investing money, resources, time, because we know that, the rate of acceptance would be very low. Obviously, you want to be looking at learners and also administrators and teachers as well. For this research, we're only looking at the learner. Okay, so this is going to be the learner's perspective. So there is this model that we borrow from information systems theory, which is not really developed for second language acquisition, but we adapted it. We like it because it's very simple. This is mostly to use in the working, in businesses, in the work environment. So not for learning and teaching. So basically, the idea is that we look at perceived usefulness of a tool and perceived use of use. If these two are positive, if these two measures are positive, they are going to lead to intention to use, which will in turn affect usage behavior. So in other words, if they find it useful and if they find it easy to use, they're more likely to want to use it for their learning endeavors, right? So we had to adapt to the questionnaire, but the questionnaire is all here on this page. I can share with you. We adapted this for ASR writing, right? So people worked with, with a group of other students writing text using ASR. That is, using their voice to compose text. And basically, this is what we found. We found that in all the measures that we looked at, in fact, the only two measures that are really important are this one here and this one here. These are sub-items that just reinforce the notion of whether this tool that we're looking at is useful. But what we're really, really looking here in this context are these two different items here. And as you can see, they're all positive. They're all beyond 3.5, which is the threshold between favoring or accepting it and not accepting it, right? Obviously, this is followed by qualitative interviews in which you can go a little bit deeper on the findings that we obtain in the quantitative results. But the results have been very, very positive. However, we want to know what happened. I mean, this is brand new, and that we all get very excited when they start using new technology. So we want to find out what happens after students are asked to use this over a long period of time. Anyway, but we're not quite there yet. Regarding behavior and text quality, so these are the 4 different types of behavior that we found in our data set. So, I mean, there were students who only used ASR in there to compose text. There are others who use ASR and keyboarding. KB stands for keyboarding. ASR and keyboarding at the same time, so they interchangeably switch between one or the other. There were some who used ASR only, and then they went to keyboard to tweak the text. And finally, there are those who first use ASR, and then later they use both to craft the text. What is interesting about this is that we found a correlation, although the correlation was not significant, we found a correlation between the combination of ASR with keyboarding and the level of lexical diversity in the text. Lexical diversity is one of the measures that we use of text quality. Obviously, we know that it's more complex than that, but it is one objective way to measure, to assess the quality of a text. It's basically the number of rare, infrequent academic words in the text, right? Or words that are not repeated, words that are unique. So this is basically, it's more complex than that, but basically this is what it's looking at. And for this, we use this software here, Talid, that is merely a compilation of different methods. You just put the text there and then you get the outcome with the analysis. And we found that, the higher the lexical diversity, the levels of high lexical diversity were associated with the use of ASR with keyboarding, which is very interesting, we found, right? Because it seems like you take advantage of what the two have to offer. One is more effective, efficient, while the other one requires more, maybe attention, maybe a little bit more work, refinement, and so forth. Then we did another study. This one here, we asked a group of 20, it's still ongoing, we're still collecting data, but these are the results so far. So we got a group of 20 people to write text throughout a course, an English language course. And they wrote pretty much the same text, except that some wrote about A while the others wrote about B. And we compare the outcome of what they produced. So we selected 150 from ASR and 50 from using keyboarding, and then we compare. This is the profile that we have on the screen. I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but what we found for ASR is that the texts were much longer. Look at the difference here between the text composed by ASR. It's almost double the amount of words. So if you write with ASR, you're more likely to write more. The other one is that you're more efficient, you're faster. Look at the difference here. Not only is ASR faster, but also produces more words. So they're long and efficient. On the other hand, the keyboarding group provided more lexical variation, which is good, provided more genre appropriateness by using more academic words, and more importantly, was rated better by the teacher. This is very important, right? Rating better by a teacher is very important because this is in reality how students' compositions are assessed, right? So I think in terms of quality, we're not quite there considering this study, no? But I think that by combining the two, we would get the best of both worlds. Okay, so now we're switching to the third and last part of this presentation. I still need about 10 minutes. I'm going to be late. But anyway, so we're now going to talk about interaction, right? Which is the orange color, as you can see on your screen. So this is, I usually call it a poor cousin way of being engaged with the technology to learn, right? So this is a type of interaction that learners can have with a technology. And in this example here, I'm going to show you my example trying to learn a few words in Ukrainian. So basically, you type the word you want to learn in English, then you listen to, then you see the translation in Ukrainian, then you can play as many times as you want.
Привіт, як справи? Привіт, як справи?
And then you practice, you take notes, whatever. Then you reverse the languages, you switch the language, and then you can use ASR and say, Привіт, як справи? Then you see whether the software will transcribe it accurately. So this can give you feedback. And then you can also listen to your own pronunciation as well, right? So I think this is a very interesting tool for learning. In fact, we did a study in which we looked at groups of students learning Dutch as a second language. So we gave them a set of 10 sentences to learn. And then over a period of time, we check them again, and they're able to learn Dutch as a second language. I mean, aspects, those 10 sentences that they're asked to examine, that they're asked to learn on their own. So this is more like learning, it's more like self-directed or semi-self-directed learning in a computer-assisted language learning environment. I'm not going to play this video here. It's very similar to what I just showed you, but the results are very optimistic. They are not only able to learn those two phrases over the 3-week treatment, but they're also, they were delayed post-tested a couple of weeks later, and they're still able to remain some of the learning that took place on the immediate post-test. So the research has been kind of, there's not really much research on ASR, I mean, on Google Translate. The bulk of the research regards translation for pedagogical purposes. But we know for translation, Google Translate is not the ideal tool. So the findings are not really that interesting. For ASR and for TTS, the results are very optimistic, but these are not really large-scale studies. These are all, they all sound like, you know, those kinds of papers that you write for a course in computer-assisted language learning. They are not really very, I would say, large scale in scope. But the issues is that, you know, the TTS and ASR are not uniform across languages. For English, it's pretty good. For Dutch, it's not as good, right? For Ukrainian as well, it's okay. You can learn certain things, but it's not great. And more importantly, there's no variation. there's no, you don't have that option of selecting the voice you want to hear. It's only one which is given by the system. So we know that the quality of accuracy in general is pretty good, right? As a, no, this is, I want to switch now to the quality of GTs, ASR and GTS. As I mentioned, oh, I'm sorry, I'm going backwards. Okay. One main limitation of the technology that we just talked about is that it's static, right? There is no conversational support, which is a big problem. To solve this problem, we started to explore what we call intelligent personal assistants, or IPAs. Are those devices that you can see on the screen, such as Alexa, Siri, Cortana, and so on. So it's voice control, then you can find in lots of different devices. You probably have used some of those, at least your iPhone or your telephone, your computer, or your smart TV. And I'm going to show you how it works. And when you listen to this, I would like you to reflect on this question. Is it bad for L2 learning? Like, do you think that what you're going to see now is a positive feature for second language learning?
Alexa, which writer wrote Westworld?
I can't find an answer to the question.
Okay, I'm not going to play the second one.
Which writer wrote Westworld?
Westworld's author.
Okay, so, well, in my take, I'm not going to ask you for your opinions. We can talk about this during the Q&A if we have one. But I think this is, fabulous for second language learning, not only because he did improve in his second attempt, right? But this gave him feedback, say, no, what you said was not perfect. Try it one more time. So this is the kind of pushed output that he was pushed to do. So encouraging him to do it. In fact, we did a study with a PhD student, and I did a study on the use of these devices in second language learning, and we're comparing IPAs with ESL teachers and how they're able to understand accented speech. So as you can see here in the results, the teachers did much better than the IPA. They did much, much better than the IPA, as you can see here in the results, right? And then a good question, well, maybe, this is not good for second language pedagogy. I see this differently, right? We know that our filter is much, much, much lenient, much more lenient than that of an IPA. We get used to a person's accent, we get used to different varieties, and we're more likely to understand those varieties that we are familiar with, right? And as a teacher as well, the kinds of, of deviations from a norm that your students might produce. So I can see this as, potentially positive. Obviously, you have to look at the quality of the type of miscommunication or misunderstanding that happened there. But what I think is very interesting is when we looked at the strategies that people use and how they solve it. So when a human is communicating with an IPA, there's a breakdown. So what caused the breakdown? Not what caused, what strategy do they use afterwards? Very interestingly, we looked that repetition and rephrasing were the most common strategies that learners use to solve that communication breakdown, right? Which is very interesting again, because that promoted more speaking, more reassessment of what they had already said. So there are many, many interesting aspects of this kind of technology for research, as you can see on the screen. Interestingly, we haven't seen a lot of gains for listening practice. If you're planning to look at this for the future, there are many interesting options that we can also consider, as you can see on the screen. I'm going to have to go this a little bit fast so that I don't go over our break. There are very similar, again, if you're interested in doing this kind of research, you could replicate some of the stuff we talked about earlier. For example, you could use, ASR for practice, and then you would have a pre and post-test design in which you would look at those features that you're focusing on and see whether there is an improvement over time. Then everything was beautiful. we are able to accomplish, give our students access to the input, opportunities for output, lots of opportunities for interaction as well. And then recently, in sometime in November 2022, we were introduced to ChatGPT, and they really, really changed the dynamics of a lot of these things we've been doing, because those differences that we talked about earlier are more blurred in this context. There was a kind of an overlap between these. So now we need to revise some of the things we have been doing now. This is amazing time for researchers, amazing time for students, amazing time for teachers, because we can start exploring these new tools based on the whole body of research that we have already accumulated, right? The more recent ones are Advanced Voice Mode, which was released, in fact, 10 days ago. I'm going to show you what it is like. It's amazing tool for as a conversational partner. And Gemini by Google, that was released about a month ago. And last night, as I was going to bed, I was reading my feed, Copilot has released Copilot version 2, which does exactly the same. So if you're interested, these are the technologies that can do the kinds of things that I'm going to show you in a few minutes. So the question that we're asking, is this the future of IPA? Is it the future of these types of interactions with the technology? And I'm going to show you the example that I mentioned to you earlier, which is an interaction between this person or this group of people with ChatGPT voice mode. In fact, it's the advanced voice mode that was released about 10 days ago.
So my friend Barrett here, he's been having trouble sleeping lately. And I want you to tell him a bedtime story about robots and love.
Once upon a time, there was a robot named Byte.
Let's do this in a robotic voice now.
Initiating dramatic robotic voice. Once upon a time.
Can you end the story, but do it in a singing voice?
And they lived circuitly ever after.
So I'm going to show you.
So anyway, you can see the types of interactions you can have. You can have a conversation. You can ask Unfortunately, I was planning to show. I downloaded it on my phone to show you, but we'll not have the time to do that. But you can, for example, ask the voice can you teach me a lesson on how to pronounce A? I'm a beginner student. Obviously, it's all in the prompt. You have to tell the voice what you are and what your goals are. And then you can engage in conversation and keep correcting the interlocutor, the voice, so that they can find your level, the level you want, or the goals you want, right? So that was an example of the kinds of things you can do. When I showed this video at another plenary that I gave a few months ago, this was still in beta stage. Now it is open to the public. Right. This one that I'm going to show you now, it's still in beta. It's not available to the public. It's the same ChatGPT, but it's not available. That is the use of vision and the use of vision. Now you can use audio and text, but you cannot use visions. I mean, images around you, which is what I'm going to show now.
I want to introduce you to somebody.
What's your name, little fluff ball?
This is Bowser.
Well, hello, Bowser. Aren't you just the most adorable little pig?
Yeah.
Look at you and don't.
This is one of his favorite things.
Anyway, so you get the idea, right? How we can have serious or maybe not so serious conversation with these devices, and it can really target this conversations to the kinds of things we want to learn, we want to engage in, we want to practice. So I'm going to move on now to conclude, because we way beyond the time that we had planned. So I would like you again to go back to the very same first class that we talked about in the beginning. Imagine those types of constraints that we had, that is limited input, limited output, limited exposure, limited opportunities for interaction. And I would like you to reflect on the technologies that we have discussed so far. TTS, for example, for input, ASR for output, and those types of interactive tools that we looked at for interaction. Right. And I would also like to think about the reasons for why you think, those technologies are interesting and why they are likely to yield positive results. I'm not going to bore you with all these different reasons for why. I can share the slides with you later, but these are some of the reasons that we have compiled that could explain why we think these technologies are very interesting for accomplishing the goals that we talked about earlier. So to conclude, in this presentation, we highlighted the role of these three technologies in education, particularly with the goal of extending the reach of the classroom and therefore address the time constraint that we talked about earlier, right? And also in learner engagement and potentially improve their learning outcomes. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention. I'm all yours if there is any time for questions. So thank you.